something. And the big point that I want to make here is that what it does is sort of irrelevant. That what it does can be all the different things that we've already learned to do. So Susan did an example earlier about reading a file, and she automatically read the entire file into contents. And we saw that that took a couple, 3 lines of code to do. So what I could do is I could just create a function and say, read file text. Give it the name of the file that I want, and it will just simply give me everything back. Or maybe I say print file text and give it the name of the file, and it will automatically print it. Whatever it is that you want it to do, you're going to notice that the content of that function is going to be code that we've already learned. Now, the most important point to me, or I should say the point that's often overlooked when it comes to functions, is this part right here. The ability to give it a name. So if I created a function and I called this function print file, like that, and then inside of here I had code, 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 and that's all of the code to go in and print that file, I don't need to know necessarily what's going on inside of all of this, because if I look at this, that says print file. What do you think that's going to do, Susan?
I think maybe that will print a file.
Absolutely. And so kind of going back to that whole comment conversation, you know, comments can oftentimes be a smell that, yes, do comment, but every now and then, all that you're doing is explaining something that maybe could be simplified. So rather than putting in a comment, this is the code that will print a file, create a function, give it the name, print file, and then now you don't necessarily need that comment.
And you know
what?
On
top of that,
if you look at all the things we've been calling, all
yeah.
the functions we've been calling, somebody wrote the function read that we were using to read files earlier. Somebody wrote the function print that prints things out for us. Those are all functions someone else wrote for us.
Absolutely.
And we don't know how they work. We just call print when we want to print something on the screen. We call read when we want to read the contents of the file. And because they've got good names, yep. The code is hidden from us. For us, it makes life easier.
Exactly. And actually, this is sort of funny that I keep stealing your thunder. And,
I just stole yours.
Digging into
sorry
your
about
slide.
that.
Yeah, turnabout is fair play. And actually, again, this is sort of perfect because it's a great validation that we're moving in the right direction. If we take a look here, the next part of the slide, you've already used functions. You know, you've already used print and open and write and close. And here's the thing. I've been developing for years.
Yep.
That might have gotten garbled.
Yeah, it's an audio issue.
Yeah, exactly. It must have been an audio issue.
Yep.
But I've been programming for many, many years. I'll be honest. I have no idea how to make a call into the Windows APIs and open a file. I've got no clue. Why? Because every single programming language, every single environment that I've ever used has provided a wrapper for all of that. So all I had to do is just simply say, open, or open file, or something like that, and it automatically made the calls behind the scenes for me. It automatically read the 1s and 0s off the disk. I didn't have to do any of that. And I didn't need to know how to do all of that. How that happens behind the scenes, I've got no clue. But can I do my job? If the task is read data from this file, can I perform that successfully? Absolutely. And I don't need to know how things work underneath. And that's the whole goal of a function, is it can help simplify things. I'm taking away the stuff that I really don't care about. I'm putting it over here. I'm just giving it a bigger name, and then just calling it. And again, kind of going back to the bread machine, I have no idea how a bread machine works. I don't need to know. I just put in my ingredients, I hit start, and in 3 hours, I've got bread.
Yep.
So, yep. You love your bread machine, don't you?
I do. I use our bread machine all the time. And I love several comments of when you slice the bread and put it in your free toaster.
Yes.
It's been coming up in the comments. And I also want to make a specific call out to the person who suggested with Marmite, because Marmite, some of you may have heard of Vegemite. There was a song, you know, she just smiled and passed me a Vegemite sandwich, which made Vegemite famous.
Yeah.
The British equivalent is Marmite. I actually like Marmite. If you've never had it, most people think it tastes absolutely disgusting. So I'm happy shout out to that one lone person out there as well who also likes Marmite. Moving on.
You found the one person
I found the other person who likes Marmite.
Well done. All right. So then why create functions is exactly what we've just said here. So code reuse, you are going to be doing the exact same thing over and over again. Simplify your code. So rather than having, a big comment or a big block of code that requires some level of interpretation, you can just create a function. And it can also help break down your code that, a lot of times you're going to be dealing with multiple things that maybe what I need to do is I need to collect some user input. So, maybe that's going to be a bunch of input statements, but instead I create a function. So I'll say collect data from user. And then I create that as a function somewhere else. And then now I need to write that out to file. So I say write data to file. And again, that's created somewhere else. And so now when I go in and I look at this, that's pretty simple. That I know exactly what that's going to do in English. And if I need to go in and take a look, then I could go do that. But a lot of times, just that high level, that's all that I'm going to need. And then finally, last but not least, is it is going to make it easier to make changes. That let's say later on that instead of writing out to a file, I've decided that we are going to write out to a database, or maybe what I want to do is write it out to a file and write it out to the screen at the same time.
Sure.
I only need to update that in one place rather than going around to the 8 places where we've got that same bit of code. So why create functions? Because in the long run, this is going to make your life easier. This is going to make it easier to do the most important thing. If you've learned nothing else this week, the most important thing about being a developer is to be a lazy developer. Lazy coders. For good functions will help make you a lazy coder. All right. Well then, how do we create a function? So, first little part that we're going to need is we're going to need keyword def, which is short for define.
Makes sense.
Okay. Next part right here is going to be the name of the function. Now, the name of a function is extremely important because this is now what you're going to keep using over and over and over again. So we were talking about variable names earlier, and when you're choosing good variable names, you want to make sure that it's nice and clear, that I can look at that and go, okay, I know exactly what's going on there. Cool. Well, I want the exact same thing when it comes to functions, that if I can look at a variable and figure out, oh, okay, well, that's the piece of data that it's calling, I need to make sure that when I look at a function, I know exactly what it's going to do. Because if I look at a function and I go, well, I don't know exactly what that's going to do, and I then have to go look at the code, I've sort of failed a little bit there. Yeah, that now I've defeated a bit of the purpose, because a bit of the purpose is to not have to go look at that code unless I explicitly need to know that maybe I need to do a little bit of debugging, or maybe I'm just curious, hey, exactly what is it that it's doing? But if I have to look at it to figure out what it's doing because the name isn't clear, that's a problem.
Yeah, we should be able to do better.
Exactly.
Yeah, we want to make this, one of those things so that we don't need 22 lines of comments to explain something whenever we call it.
Exactly. Yep. That's exactly it.
So now, can we talk to the guys who built STRP time?
I'll work on that. Now, the next thing to note here, and I'm putting this on the slide just for kind of full disclosure, you'll notice that you can also set up parameters. We're going to talk about that later. So okay. I promise you, we're going to have that. And then finally, last but not least, is you put the body of whatever it is that you want it to do tabbed in, and then finally you're going to notice a return statement right there. Now, what return for right now is going to mean is it's just simply going to mean exit. It's going to denote the end of the function. Return can mean something else, which we'll talk about in a little while, but for right now, kind of keeping things simple, it's just going to be exit. Awesome. So now, the question becomes, well, how do we call it? Well, the way that we call it is really the exact same way that we've called other functions. That if you remember calling open, if you remember calling print, all that we did was name, parentheses. Name, parentheses. That's it. So if we take a look here, you're going to notice define print message. Print message. Done and done. That's it. let's do it.
Yeah, I want to see it live. Because one thing on a slide, I sort of get it, but it makes more sense when you actually see it running in the code. Somehow that makes more sense.
100%. Okay. Let's see. This is module 13, functions. There we go. Okay. So, little coding thing.
Okay.
If you're putting a whole bunch of things into one file, and you're putting your functions into that same file, one of the things that you'll want to decide is kind of where you want to put everything. And typically, I like having my functions down towards the bottom. And the main reason for that is just so that way I can kind of more easily focus in on what's important and worry about the other functions later. So I can go in and say, for example, like define, and we'll just say print message. And there we go. Whoops, don't forget your colon, Christopher. And let's just go ahead and say print and hello world. Got to start out with hello world. We'll say return, which is spelled with an N today.
I feel like it's nice. It's sort of almost feel like we're coming around to beginning again. Hello world comes back.
Exactly. Hello world comes back. And then you'll notice right up there at the very top that I've got my print message. Now, this is, and I swear to you this is true, this is an on-purpose error.
Yep. I had a suspicion you were going to do this one.
I did this one on purpose. One of the things that we've been highlighting an awful lot is differences between code. And depending on the language that you're in, sometimes you need to define things earlier, sometimes you can define it later on. Here, what you're going to notice, if we kick back to my code here, is it's going to tell me print message is not defined. Control-P print, can't find printer. It's right here. So my... I'm just going to keep quoting a comedian.
Go ahead.
But in any event, what you're going to notice is we've got print message. It's right here. But the problem is that we put the calling up top.
Yep.
And we defined it down below.
So it's a little bit like when you try to reference a variable, in the wrong order.
Exactly.
You can't reference a variable and then create it later. It just doesn't really make sense.
Exactly. And that's a perfect way to put it. That's a perfect analogy, is that you can't define a variable later on and then use it earlier. Same thing here. And so now, if I reorganize my code, which I just did real quickly behind the scenes, you're going to notice that now this prints out hello world. So again, I'm going to stick with it. Kind of keep all your code block together. And like I said, typically I would like it down at the bottom. Not able to do that here. Not a problem. Just put it all up at the top and then go ahead and define everything down below. Now, another little trick that you could use to get around this, and you see this an awful lot, is to maybe go something like define and then main. And main in a lot of languages is a keyword.
Okay.
That main is how you start a program. And so what you're going to notice is I've reworked things, and this is actually going to work out really well. So I'm doing two things at the same time. The first thing that I want to highlight is you're going to notice that I created this brand new function up here, and I called it main.
Okay.
Now, main, again, this is in a lot of other environments, is the standard entry point. So Java uses it, .NET uses it, I'm pretty sure C++ uses it. I don't want to admit how long it's been since I've done C++. So, but I'm pretty sure if I remember right, C++ does it, and so forth. So all that we're doing is kind of sticking with that convention. So you'll notice that I created a brand new function here that I've called main. And then you're going to notice that I called one function from another.
Yep.
Now, I'm highlighting this, but if you stop and think about it, this shouldn't necessarily come as a huge surprise, because, Susan, what's print?
Print's a function.
It's a function. So when we did our print message, I already called a function from a function.
Yep.
So it would stand to reason that I could call another function from a function. Now, again, you're going to notice that if I go in and I hit start, that now it behaves a little bit differently. You'll notice that now this is working.
Yeah.
And you might be thinking, well, time out, Christopher, hold on. Hold on.
It looks like you still are calling it before it's declared.
Exactly. It looks that way. But I'm not. And this is a very big point. When you define a function, what you're doing is you're saying when somebody calls this function, this is what I am going to do. And notice my conjugation there. Notice the tensing. This is what I'm going to do. Not what I did, but what I'm going to do. So and if we come back to the code here, when I called main, what I'm doing right now is I'm saying execute the main function. I don't need to shout. Execute the main function. That's what I'm doing. I'm explicitly stating I want to call that main function right now. And in order for me to do that, the function must be created.
Aha, and it was created before you actually called main, that you could see the function defined before you actually called it.
Exactly. Now, when I define a function, what I'm doing here is I'm saying define this function. When someone calls this function, execute this code. So again, you're going to notice my tensing here that when I define the function, I'm going to wait until somebody calls the function to execute that code. So future tense.
Yes.
So what's going to happen is the Python parser is going to read through all those definitions, kind of put them into memory, as it were, and wait for somebody to call them. So nothing inside of here is actually being checked until we go in and call it. So that's why I could get away with print message.
Yep.
And so now I've gotten to the scenario that I kind of like, which is this is the body of my program, of my script, of whatever it is that I'm doing, and then down below are all of my method functions, and then down here at the very end is what's kicking it off. So, if I added another comment,
you're not actually executing any code until you reach that line that says main.
Exactly.
All by itself.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Okay, I'm going to take a drink.
Okay. Well done.
Thank you. I kept waiting for a good point when you were going. But
you were hoping me to go a little longer.
Yeah, exactly.
No, my
keep
apologies,
talking. Keep talking.
You've had your drink now. Now I'll let you go back.
Okay, perfect. All right. So there is the basics of how we're going to go in and define that function. Now, in my case, I've kept it relatively straightforward, at least as far as the bodies go, that you're going to notice that all I did was just simply print and then hello world. And I drank too fast, so I need to. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so you'll notice that I kept it very simple, that I just went with print and hello world. But could I have also done, maybe something like this is let me call this print names, and maybe call this print names, and then we'll go ahead and say names equals, and then we'll say Christopher, and we'll say Susan, and we'll say Danny, because I'm going to get his name right, which will make him very happy. There we go. And then I could go, I could say for name in names, and don't forget your colon, Christopher.
Don't forget your colon.
And then I could go ahead and say print name. So could I go in and do something like that? And the answer is 100% yes. And of course, if I hit start here, you're going to notice Christopher, Susan, Danny.
Yep.
Cool. So it's doing exactly what we think that it would do, that really this block of code right here, there is nothing that we haven't already learned there. So can I open a file? Could I, parse CSV? Could I, write to a database? Whatever it is that you want to be doing, the answer is 100% yes. That if you can write it in code, you can put it inside of a function. Awesome. All right. Now again, just to kind of highlight this, the one nice part about all of this is that all I have to do is I just have to say print names. I don't need to know what's going on inside of print names. I now know it's going to print the names.
Though I will point out one thing.
Yeah.
Since you created this function, obviously at some point you knew exactly what was going on inside that function.
That
right?
is true.
So you say, I don't need to know.
Because
but the nice thing is once you have created that function, you can almost forget about it.
Yeah, exactly.
But when you create it, you have to know what's going on.
Exactly, yeah. And when you start to get a bit more advanced, you're going to start to create your own little helper libraries and maybe share those out with other developers, so they might not know what it is that you've done.
Yes.
So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't have that short term of a memory. My memory is really short, however. Okay, cool. So anyway, so there is our little functions there, and kind of how we can break all of that down. Awesome. Now,
You know what? Actually, can I suggest one of my favorite functions that I always like to write for myself?
please.
I like writing a function that will format dates the way I want them. Because you know that we talked about that syntax for that string f time and the %b's and all that is so confusing.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's something I hate looking up. And I find that when I'm working with dates, 99% of the time I want it displayed the same time because it's for the same group of users and they want it the same way. So one of the functions I often create for myself, one of the first ones I end up creating, is a function that will display a date the way I want to.
Yep. Exactly.
And that way, once I've done that once, I kind of forget about writing out how you do the str f time thing all the time. I just call my function when I need it.
Exactly. You know, and a lot of people were asking earlier about, looping through through an array and maybe finding every particular item and if it, getting rid of duplicates and things like that. Well, this is exactly where functions come into play, because could you do that? Absolutely. You would just take a loop and you go through and eliminate your duplicate. The problem is that, it's going to be, a few handful of lines of code. That's perfect for a function, because then I could just create a function, call it remove duplicates, pass in my list, and then let it do its thing. Ooh. Pass in its list.
Oh, and I need that for my date functionality too, because I'd have to let you pass in the date.
Absolutely.
That's going to be, and it would have to give me back. So you'd have to pass in the date you want formatted, and the function would have to give you back the nicely formatted string. So you're right. I need, and it actually already came up in the Q&A. As you can imagine, someone's going, hey, how do I pass a value to that function? So I'm glad we're there.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you look at the bit of code that I've got here, the only 3 names that this is ever going to print is going to be Christopher, Susan, and Danny. Period. End of sentence. That's it. So what happens if we want to be able to maybe allow somebody to pass in the group of names that we're now going to display out? Well, that's exactly what we're going to get into. So I'm going to go back to my slides here. There we go. Okay. So we want the functions to be more dynamic. Now, the functions that we created were good because they did one thing, and sometimes that's all that you need. But sometimes we need a bit more flexibility. So maybe we need to pass in a parameter about whether or not we want to set up custom messages, or maybe 2 numbers to perform a calculation, or maybe we want to write it out to the screen, but optionally write that out to a file as well. Wouldn't that be nice?
I like it.
And that's exactly where parameters come into play. Now, here's the thing. Parameters, fantastic Scrabble word, if you can, fit that on there, is a very fancy word for a concept that we've already played with. A parameter is going to store a value. Hey, Susan.
Yeah.
What have we already used for something that would store a value?
A variable?
A variable, exactly.
All right.
So what's a parameter?
Do I get a point?
You get a point. You got a gold star today and you get a point.
I'm having a good day.
Well done. We'll have to figure out how you can cache those later. In any event, so a parameter is really nothing but a specialized variable. It's a variable for a function. And what's going to happen is, rather than saying, like we did in the past, variable equals whatever we want the value to be, we're going to wait for somebody else to give us what that value is. So it's just like a variable. And in fact, we've already used parameters. That, remember when we said print hello world?
Yep.
Parameter.
Yes, true. I was passing a value to the print function.
Exactly. That's it. So we could actually update our little methods to accept parameters. So I give you an example here. Print message, give me the message. And then all we're going to do is just display it out with print message. Now, while we're here, you might be looking at this and you might be thinking, Christopher, you're keeping things relatively simple. And you know what?
Those are very simplistic examples.
Yeah, you're 100% right, because I'm focused in on creating functions. But I got to tell you, so many of my functions are really actually 2-3 lines long, and that's it. Because sometimes even just that little bit of cleanup can make a big difference, especially if I'm doing the same thing over and over and over again, or if, we've kind of poked fun at strf time, if it's not overly clear, creating your own function, like Susan mentioned earlier, can make life that much easier. So don't be afraid to create a function that's only 1 or 2 lines long. If it's going to simplify your code, do it. Don't be, there is no minimum number of lines for a function. I would say, however, there is a maximum in that if you have to scroll up and down, your function is probably too long, that it's probably going to be trying to do too much, or really, more practically, it's hard to read. That if you're having to scroll to read through a function, especially when you're trying to debug it, that just winds up making it that much harder to try and debug. So really limit yourself to one screen per function.
A function does one thing.
Exactly.
Don't write a function that does 20 different things. Write a function that will open the file you're planning to use. Write a function that will take the contents of the file and return you all the animal names from the file.
Exactly.
But don't try to write one that will open the file, get all the animal names, do all the error handling for that, and close the file and take the result and print them on the screen. That point, that's your program.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So what you would do is you take each individual component of that, break that down into different functions, give those all good names, and then go ahead and call them, and that way you could stack them from there, and it makes it that much easier. Don't create a function that's going to take in a parameter and figure out, okay, well, we're going to write to a file, or we're going to write to a database, or we're going to write it up to Azure, or then you're just making your life difficult. Okay, so with that, let's go in and kind of keep going with our parameters here. What about multiples? Well, you could absolutely add in multiple parameters by just simply separating them out with commas. That's it. So just simply define display message, greeting and name, and then just simply concatenate that together, and then you'll notice that we can just print that out like that. Cool. Let's go in and take a look at a demo here. So let me open back up Visual Studio. So here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to, right up here, I'm going to, give me your names. There we go. Let's put our names right up here. And I'm going to say new name equals input, and let's say enter last guest, like that. We'll say names, append, and then that new name. And now here's what I want to do, is I want to print out those names, but you're going to notice that I, in my case here, have put together my names up here.
Uh-huh.
That's what I've done.
Yep.
So what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to take those names and send those down there.
I like it.
This is where a parameter comes into play. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a parameter that I'm going to call names. And then up here, I'm going to say print names and then pass in my names. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out. Number one is what's going to happen behind the scenes. Actually, before I get there, I'm going to call it list for right now.
Okay.
Okay. Just because I'm going to try and avoid confusion, then I'll step back.
Sure.
So here's what's going to happen. Names is automatically going to be passed into there. So it really is almost as if behind the scenes I said list equals names.
Okay.
It's almost identical
Sure.
to me doing that. So just like a variable, but I just don't have to say name equals and then whatever the value was. That happens automatically behind the scenes.
So the value that I specify when I'm calling it gets put into the variable name that's used in the function.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's it. That's it. And so now, let me go in and start this. And you'll notice that it will ask me for my, my last guest. Let's invite Satya.
Oh, yes.
Hit enter, and sure enough, it displays Christopher, Susan, Danny, and Satya. Cool. Now, I want to go back to what I did a second ago, where I had this as names. And you might be looking at that, and you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. You already used names.
Christopher?
Yes.
I'm confused. I've got the variable name names inside main, and then I
Yeah.
have another variable name names inside print names. I'm confused.
Good. Well, not necessarily good, but let me help. One of the interesting things about functions, and I do have a slide on this, is functions also serve as a container. By the way, the big fancy technical term for this is scope.
And we actually had somebody say, maybe you guys should discuss scope, actually popped up in the Q&A. I said, we're not going to get too deep into it.
No.
Because we don't want to get too far, but
Exactly.
we'll just touch on it here.
Exactly, yeah. Because scope can become very complex really quickly. So what I'm going to do for right now is just kind of define it as this. Our functions create containers. Our containers define what's known as a scope, or more simply, a variable's lifetime. So if I declare a variable as a parameter or inside of a function, once we get to the end of that function, all of those variables go away. So after this, names is now no longer available.